appreciate that, since I would cause a delay, just trying to figure out how to do this next thing. I'm really happy to be here at the League of Women Voters. If there's a finer civic group in the United States, I'm unaware of it. It's really been something. I live across the border in Pullman. I much appreciate the meetings in Colfax and the way I'm able to learn about issues in my region. The only source that really works in a nonpartisan way for me is the League of Women Voters. So I'm really happy to be here. My topic is sort of how you get from there to here. What's involved in the global system, the national system, and then the local system. I won't go into much to how communities actually organize themselves to serve a refugee community, because that's what our colleague Kristen will focus on. If I can start somewhere else, though, I'm going to start here with something called the Martin McClure Student Ambassadorship. So I represent the Martin Institute. It was founded by Boyd and Grace Martin in 1979 to study the causes of war and the conditions necessary for peace in the international system. And it is one that honored the legacy of Boyd Martin, who was at the University of Idaho from the 1930s until the mid-1990s, and was interested in dialogue, even though he had a very strong ideological perspective of his own. One of his students, who had a very different ideological perspective of his, was James McClure, who's the founder of the McClure Center for Public Policy Research, also at the University of Idaho. They believed that you could work in a nonpartisan fashion with partisan perspectives about working together to come up with solutions that were maybe not ideal for either individual party, but good for the populace and citizenry as a whole. I think that should resonate with the League of Women Voters pretty well. A couple of years ago, we decided that we needed to partner together through something we call the Martin McClure Student Ambassadorship. So this is a program that sort of capitalizes on the international focus of the one and the Idaho focus of the other. And so we're talking about taking topics that are germane internationally and germane in Idaho, and taking a top-notch undergraduate student researcher and turning them loose on a problem under the mentorship of the directors of both programs. So we've done it 4 times. These are the 4 topics. Depending on what the student interest is, we go in different directions. It has to match what the both institutes want and what the student wants. You may remember several years ago when the country of Turkey tried to copyright the phrase Idaho agriculture, which would have meant we could not have sold things in Turkey that were from Idaho agriculture, because there's this thing called geographic indicators. You're familiar with wines that have a specific name. For example, there's a difference between champagne and sparkling wine. Similar product, but there's a geographic protection for that region in France. So we did that topic, and she presented all over the state to different agricultural associations, to the dairymen, and to policymakers, including Senator Risch, about the importance of being proactive in protecting these sorts of things. And we come through, though, to this year, Alma Delich, who's a junior in international studies at the University of Idaho, one of my students. She prepared this Idaho at a Glance policy document about refugees in Idaho. So I'm going to send these around. I didn't quite bring this, but I think I have about 35, so if you're a couple who doesn't mind sharing, that would be fantastic. But it'll walk through a lot of what we're covering here from an Idaho perspective. So this was published just a couple of weeks ago at the McClure Center. It goes to all the county commissioners. It's going to other policymakers. Its goal is to communicate in a nonpartisan fashion how all this stuff comes to be and how a refugee comes to Idaho. So you can look through these as you wish. One of the things I really appreciate about these documents is they're supposed to combine the complexity of an issue in a thorough and succinct and relatable format. So all the stuff we're talking about, if we don't quite get all the connections and lines drawn between the other thing, this will give it to you in a nice fashion. Alma Delich herself came to Idaho with her parents when she was a young girl as a refugee from the civil war in Yugoslavia. She's a Bosniak herself, and it's very interesting to me. These conversations are different for me than they maybe used to be. At the University of Idaho now, and me in my role at the Martin Institute of working with students, I get to talk about all kinds of global issues. And a lot of the global issues we deal with, they're sticky, they're uncomfortable, they're hard to address, they're depressing. I mean, how do you find joy in studying some of the things that Florian just talked about? When you're talking about ethnic cleansing, and you think, good news, we ended the genocide in Rwanda, that should be a victory, we should feel good. Oh, except those people just fled across the border and they're doing the same thing in Congo now. I mean, those are hard things to deal with. So look for these success stories where things come together internationally in interesting ways. And I want to introduce you to, the picture's really not here about President Obama. This is Alfred Monserai and his son Bonky. Alfred is from Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone had a civil war in the 1990s. It was a pretty nasty one, where one of the common things that rebel groups would do was invade a part of the countryside where they're interested in, particularly in recruiting child soldiers, but give people the choices of long sleeve or short sleeve. What they're basically asking is, how much of your arm do you want us to cut off? You get to choose. And it was really nasty and bloody and long. And Alfred was a teenager, and when his family's village was attacked, he and his friends were outside the village. They hid in the bush because they were the ones they were looking for to take to be soldiers. By the time the coast clears and he comes into the village, his family's gone, his brother's dead. He finds his sister's arm, he doesn't know what's up with the rest of the family, and they take off overland to try and make it to Ghana, where the UN had a refugee camp that they could get to and be protected. When he's in Ghana, one of the things that Florian mentioned is that a lot of times refugees aren't allowed to work. They're also often not allowed to attend university, for example. I mean, because you're talking about a host country, a lot of times in countries that are vulnerable and fragile themselves, that are not set up to, for example, if you're Lebanon, have more than 1 million Syrians join your ranks. What do? Well, you keep them in the camps because you just can't deal with them in your the rest of your society. Your healthcare is overwhelmed, your school's overwhelmed. You can't maintain employment for your people. It's frightening. But Ghana, because he and his friends had had a high school education, let them leave camp and go to the University of Accra and get a year's worth of college education. It's a unique thing. And if he had happened to be in other camps in Ghana, it wouldn't have worked. But in this one, they made an arrangement. It worked. While he was at the refugee camp then, he won what's called the lottery by people who are in refugee camps. A country in the West agreed to resettle them. This is sort of key, and this is something that I hope that you'll remember. As much as we talk about refugees coming to the U.S. and Idaho, it's less than 1% of that global population that Florian mentioned that ever get resettled. Less than 1%. So we're really talking about people who did win the lottery, where something magical happened for them, oftentimes in a blind draw. And he talked about being in camp and being passed over when 30 were going to Norway and 40 were going to Australia and stuff, that he didn't get any. And then at the end of the year, when we hadn't quite met our quota that year in the United States, we said we would take 100 more, and he got drawn out of the hat. And he gets drawn out of the hat by the United States. As I'll show you in the next slides, there's a whole host of organizations that have to come together to work perfectly. So in order for them to be protected and successful. But he gets to the United States, he remembers that when he was young, a couple from Moscow, Idaho, who were in the Peace Corps, had come to his village, and that maybe he should visit them. And while he was visiting them, he heard about the Martin Institute at the University of Idaho and came in and said, "Hey, I've got some college credits. Could I?" "Yes, you can. We want to have you." Then he finds a welcoming community in Moscow, Idaho, graduates from the University of Idaho, gets a job with Lutheran Support Services in Maryland. Now he works for the U.S. Passport Office, gets selected to be a hero of Maryland in some sort of a community event, and he's hosted at the White House. He's not allowed to bring guests, but decided he'd try and smuggle his baby in because she's going to turn away him and his baby. And then you end up with this. But all right, if everything doesn't work right, international organizations, aid groups, nations like the United States, all kinds of volunteers, and then host communities, he's probably dead in a field, or a child soldier who ends up dead in a battle somewhere. That's really his lot in life, but everything works perfectly. And so, not perfectly, had a lot of hiccups along the way, but it works out perfectly. And when I get down about the kind of stuff I study, I've got his picture on my desk. I was in Washington last summer. He took me to lunch. It was, we met at the Passport Agency. It's amazing. And this morning I taught a class, 53 students in a class about the United Nations. 7 of the students came to Idaho as refugees. So when I say here there's policy, process, and procedures, yes. And I can talk about the future of what we might do, for example, under a Trump administration, and I can talk about them more or less dispassionately. If you talk about refugees who are here, I cannot. These are people. These are my current students, 15% of a class, refugees here in Idaho from a variety of countries. It's interesting because the students who, the rest of the students in class tend to come to a course on something like the United Nations with a cynical perspective. Who think, okay, this is a problematic organization that might do some good. These guys come to this and think, this is the organization that saved my life, and there's some problems. It's a very different perspective and makes for very interesting conversation groups. So, all right. So, the global framework, briefly. 2 parts here. And one part is the convention, the international agreements that set up the commitments that countries make to help refugees. The defines refugee, migrant, and asylum seeker in a different way, similar to what Florian's talking about, but a little different way. And then you have some agencies that do work, and there's two main ones with the third one here. All kinds of other support being given. For example, if you're in a refugee camp and children need help, UNICEF, the UN Children's Agency, is absolutely there. And the UN Population Fund is absolutely there. All kinds of international governmental and non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations are there. The main ones are these. So you have these differences between the original convention that countries got together and signed in 1951. It was place-specific and time-specific. If you were a refugee before January 1, 1951, and you were in Europe, you were covered by the convention. If you weren't, the convention didn't apply to you. So even though then after that the global community got together and helped refugees, because there certainly were more that came after 1951, there was no binding commitment to do so. That comes in 1967 that just said this covers new refugees in new places. And it basically is an umbrella thing that says if you commit to the protocol, you'll help people all over the place. The main form of help you offer is to host or to help host refugees. And the big difference in these two words here, so migrant is a big umbrella term that refers to people moving for all kinds of different reasons. And one of them could be because they're becoming a refugee. They're also a migrant. But the differentiation in the convention and the protocol is whether you've left because of that direct threat to your person. It's a collective status given. So one of the differences that we'd have in those two definitions is this is collective and this is individual. So this is a group threat. Your group is a threat. You all have the right to leave and have to have protection. If you individually are threatened and you leave, you can appeal for an individual review of your case to be an asylum seeker, which can then make you a refugee and a migrant, and all that goes together. But it's basically collective and individual. There's some exceptions, but that's the basic differentiation. It also says this. They promise, the global community promises, that if you're at that threat and you get to a host community, then that's where you're granted refugee status. That means if you're in Syria and you flee into Turkey, and Turkey's a member of both the convention and the protocol, that's where you're protected. If you decide to leave Turkey and head for Sweden or Germany, you're no longer protected. That's what they agreed to in the convention, and this. It wasn't an open invitation to migrate for economic or personal or other reasons. It was different. All right. I'm not quite done. I think I had 3 minutes. Anyway, so I started when he was still talking, I'm pretty sure. So it's a collective versus an individual right. And then it's managed by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and this is a specific one for Palestinians, which has been, they thought maybe it was going to be a short-term agency in 1948, and is still going strong today. There's some issues and challenges, things with the UNHCR. For example, in some of the camps it runs, it's almost a semi-sovereign entity. It's really kind of problematic sometimes for countries to host an agency that has so much power within their camp to determine policies and procedures. There's a negotiation that goes on with what to do with refugees if they leave the camp, but in the camp, UNHCR can do a lot that a normal agency can't. But we don't have time to get into that. I'd be happy to come back next summer sometime and get into it more deeply. IOM covers travel. So that's the international system, and then they interact with a national framework. Okay, so the national level, immigration and citizenship is a thing that nations determine. So the main commitment in the convention and the protocol is to protect someone where they flee to. If they want to resettle, that's a national decision. It's not an international decision. There's no requirement by the UNHCR. They can't force a country to do anything, but they can negotiate with countries to accept X number of refugees from Y location. They do a lot of the initial vetting, the UNHCR, and then we decide. So the quota, the number that Florian mentioned in the thing before, is set by the executive. That's why it's an interesting time, and some people, particularly in refugee resettlement agencies, are nervous about what a Trump administration will look like. I would suggest that we didn't hear anything that suggested they would cut off all flows of refugees if Trump was president, just that they'd be concerned about refugees from certain countries of origin. There's also, it's not really sometimes it might seem like a partisan issue. It's really not, because the main organizations involved in refugee resettlement that are outside states and polities, school boards and stuff, are church groups, not all of whom are as open-minded as the Unitarians are, but who have very strong perspectives. But they are committed to resettling refugees. They believe it's a God-given job that they do so, and they're not going to let the United States under a Trump administration or any other cut-off refugee flows. They may talk about where they'll come from. That's also a decision made by the executive. Anyway, here's a list of all the agencies that are involved in processing security applications or applications to come into the United States. If a refugee wins the lottery and gets to come here, it's a very exhaustive process. It takes a couple of years. It's detailed in that handout I gave you. But it's a very comprehensive thing. It's actually the hardest way to migrate to the United States by far is to be a refugee. Most in-depth analysis and review. Then we get to the state and local level. So the main refugee centers in Idaho for resettlement initially are Boise and Twin Falls. That doesn't mean that when someone gets there, they have to stay there. For example, Alfred Monserai, he was first in Michigan and then decided to move to Idaho. So sometimes you hear people concerned that, yes, Idaho may have this many Syrians, but all the Syrians could move here if they wanted to. That's true. That's what happens to anybody who is a legal resident of the United States. We don't have geographic boundaries put on us unless we've committed a felony or something where we have to stay locally for a trial or something. Everyone else has freedom of movement. It's one of the hallmarks of the United States. So yes, of course, they can move. And then what it looks like when they get to the country and they get here to local communities. I'm going to turn over to Kristen, but I just want to emphasize that people I know who are in the refugee resettlement community and non-governmental organizations, they say that Idaho has a 40-year legacy as being one of the best places in the country for a refugee to come. That's because the structure in the state is supported by county structures, city structures, school board, hospital district. All these different structures are set up to support the relocation and integration of refugees. And it's only been the last 18 months or so that it's become an issue that people are really concerned about. Before, it was a sort of an all-hands-on-deck sort of approach in Idaho, and I'm cautiously optimistic that that will be the tale going forward. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Kristen.